Welcome to this special censored edition of No Apologies. I'm your host, Dana Loesch. Now, before we get started, in an effort to avoid being censored by big tech, namely YouTube, my team is going to be doing the censoring for us throughout this monologue. Each time I say the V word, not victory, but no, your sound didn't just go out. Okay, so back to it. I want you to try to imagine the America that we could be living in right now. In this alternative reality, there's still a coronavirus on the loose, of course, but censorship regarding the pandemic isn't happening. Instead, people are free to speak and exchange ideas and ask questions, answer questions, and have thoughts about how to best fight this virus that looks more and more like it's man-made. Just saying. Transparency rules the day in this America. Health experts like NIH's Dr. Fauci and the CDC's Rochelle Walensky, instead of telling noble lies and testing on beagles and hiding information, maybe instead they treat you, the citizen, like an adult. Imagine if they did that from the beginning, if they actually admitted things like masks may help, and yes, they would recommend them, but ultimately it's up to you whether you wear one, and if you wear one, please wear one that works like an N95. In this version of America, the theory of lab escape, that would have been embraced as an actual possibility from the beginning rather than immediately censored and people having their accounts suspended for even discussing it. Things like the inaccuracy of the early PCR tests for the virus, those tests would be acknowledged as highly imperfect. We wouldn't have changed the pandemic nomenclature from infected to cases, because case makes it sound like someone has a very serious problem with the virus and might even be dead, when in fact, most infected people, the fatality rate is like not. In fact, the survivability rate is over 99%. In this fantasy version of America that I want you to imagine, Dr. Fauci admits to America along the way that what is clearly obvious, that much about this virus, its effects, how it moves through the population, the best way to slow the spread, it's not totally clear. Imagine if the CDC didn't fearmonger. Remember CDC Director Rochelle Walensky saying that impending doom was coming based not on science, but on her personal hunch. Seriously, take a listen.
I'm going to pause here. I'm going to lose the script, and I'm going to reflect on the recurring feeling I have of impending doom. We have so much to look forward to, so much promise and potential of where we are, and so much reason for hope, but right now I'm scared.
Imagine where we would be without that. If the media, rather than promoting alarmism daily for 18 months straight, with meaningless case count numbers spinning to infinity and a parade of TV doctors freaking us out about endless variants, imagine if the media was instead responsibly cautious, optimistic, reminding Americans that this virus is highly survivable with an average age of death roughly 78%, or 78, age 78, excuse me. Our legacy media could have done their jobs, held our health agencies to account, rather than doing these weird no-answer softball interviews with Dr. Fauci, not asking him any kind of serious questions or tough questions about some of his flip-flops and contradictory statements. Had the CDC really followed the science, our kids could have continued to socialize and not missed a year plus of their lives due to social distancing and lockdowns that weren't actually about protecting them at all. In this sane version of America that never came to be, the CDC's school guidance wouldn't have been directed by teachers' unions, as we now know happened. Our hospital administrators and staff, instead of making goofy line dancing videos while at the same time telling us it's hell on earth in the COVID ward, they would have assured us that for the most part, the surge in hospitals, it's not the same as it was in Wuhan or Italy or even New York. And yes, there were steady flows of COVID patients at the height of the pandemic, but depending on where you were in America, it was manageable. And after all, our nurses and our doctors and our healthcare, we have the best people in the world, end of story. And we're getting smarter on how to treat the virus. And when Biden became president, the administration could have assured leadership by calming the country, stopping the promotion of fear and censorship. The administration could have followed the successful examples of Florida, Texas, and other states and opened America back up. But after all, we now have everything, thanks to the Operation Warp Speed from the former administration. We have this amazing experimental mRNA vaccine developed in record time. And since the Biden administration is the party of unity, they could have thrown maybe the previous administration a bone, thanked him for kickstarting this bold program as a gesture of goodwill, and then encouraged his voters to get the jab instead of saying they wouldn't take it. And then, in an America that hadn't lost its ever-loving mind, remind people that the jab is strongly encouraged, but not mandated. That would be, by the way, Sweden's approach, no mandates. Yet this country, who never locked its people down, never masked, never missed school, is one of the most populations per capita in the world. I don't know, it also maybe has to do with the Nordic location, but Swedes apparently trust their government, so they got vaccinated voluntarily. Now, in a more normal America, maybe that would have been if people were hesitant to get vaccinated and they trusted their government and media. Maybe we'd work to try to understand why they did instead of shaming them, right? We see that there's this nuance in the issue, and it's completely reasonable that some people want full FDA approval before they take it. I get it. Others may be pregnant or dealing with other health issues, or maybe they just don't want to take a chance. Still others are hesitant to have their kids maybe because that they know that their kids are not at risk. And others still may be hesitant because they have certain medical conditions that make the for them in their particular condition too risky. In an America that wasn't hysterical, the government could have ensured that hesitant Americans would never be shamed or treated as second-class citizens, or called killers, murderers, or told that they're the cause of the pandemic by the President of the United States. In this alternative reality, those who were hesitant, their concerns would be taken seriously, and they'd be encouraged to ask questions. The Biden administration and the CDC would be transparent and forthright with their answers. And if America hadn't lost its mind, the only agenda would have been protecting people's health and building trust with the American public. You can't do that by name-calling and censoring people. Remember that, America? It's the one that we used to live in before all of this coercion and censorship started. The America that existed just 18 months ago. And it's the America we should still be living in. But sadly, since the COVID crisis did not play out this way, we have to ask, what happened? And what are the impacts to American society because of the lying, the lack of transparency, and the censorship? Why did it have to be this way? Well, the answer is obvious, because of another virus. The virus of tyranny, the virus of politics. It infected every last coronavirus policy. Our health agencies and the Biden administration, who are responsible for guiding us through the pandemic, were clearly driven by political agendas, rather than just focusing solely on protecting Americans' health later, and then you can politicize whatever you want after that. Instead of moving America towards normalcy, coronavirus policies become a political cudgel used to advance a suite of Democrat pet causes. So to prove that it became politicized, just watch this video. Think about how hard Democrats have flipped on. Take a look.
They will have the very soon.
Let him finish.
Do you believe for a moment what he's telling you?
When we finally do, God willing, get a who's going to take the shot? Who's going to take the shot? You can be the first one to say, sign me up. They now say it's okay.
So let's just say there's that is approved and even distributed before the election. Would you get it?
Well, I think that's going to be an issue for all of us. I will say that I would not trust Donald Trump.
You're going to say to the American people now, here's a it was new, it was done quickly, but trust this federal administration and their health administration that it's safe. And we're not 100% sure of the consequences. I think it's going to be a very skeptical American public about taking the and they should be.
We can't trust the president and take his word and take a that might cause harm to us.
If and when the comes, and it's not likely to go through all the tests that needs to be and the trials that are needed to be done. And the question is he going to seek emergency move?
Frankly, I'm not going to trust the federal government's opinion. And I wouldn't recommend to New Yorkers based on the federal government's opinion.
If Donald Trump tells us that we should take it, I'm not taking it.
Yeah, you saw Andrew Cuomo there, right? While he was talking, that's the time that he was killing grannies and smacking fannies, apparently. So why was it okay for them to express hesitancy, but no one else can now? What explains their flop on? Very easy. A successful I think probably would have helped Trump regain the presidency. There's a lot of people who think that. I mean, it's speculation, but it's, a legitimate speculation. It's a legitimate thought. Now that he's gone, and we have Democrats have done, we've watched them do a 180 on the and now they're shaming you for saying the exact same things that they did. And that's what happens when politics infect our discourse about the pandemic. And one of the biggest aspects of this politicization is the rise of corporate censorship. So you have political agendas that are causing legitimate debate to be stifled and opinions to be censored. And that's causing another crisis, a crisis of confidence, a crisis of faith in these government institutions that Americans no longer trust, especially our health agencies. Because that's what censorship ultimately does. It undermines the very institutions who are doing the censoring, most of all. And because thanks to all of the censorship, people begin to suspect that something's up. They think maybe we're not being told everything. Maybe there's some kind of agenda. And then people start to dig in their heels and really, truly resist. This is why censorship is dangerous. And we all know that the censoring of Americans is happening, but think about what it's doing to our personal and collective health as a country. Yes, censorship affects your health very directly. And this politicization and censorship coming from the left isn't limited to coronavirus. Here's a recent tweet just from WebMD. It reads, quote, "Sex should be removed as a legal designation on the public part of birth certificates," the American Medical Association, AMA, said Monday, end quote. Now, do doctors suddenly believe, like altogether, that there's no biological sexual reality? Of course they don't. But there is intense pressure from the LGBTQ community to pretend that sex doesn't correspond with gender. Now, good medicine depends on doctors being able to act in the best interests of their patients, and they can't be kowtowing to some woke gender ideology. Doctors must be able to acknowledge biological reality, like the difference between boys and girls. After all, medicines, like antidepressants, for instance, they affect women and men differently, sort of hormones, actually. So should they ignore these biological differences to please activists? Should they censor the truth about biological sex? Only if they want their patients to be harmed. Yet doctors are increasingly afraid to tell the truth. This same kind of chilling of free speech, that's what's happening when it comes to the mRNA. So just a few weeks ago, we were told everything's safe and effective, remember? Now we're told, well, maybe it's not as effective at stopping transmission and infection of variants like we thought. But if you would have said this just like a week or two ago, like reporter Alec Berenson did, when he saw rising infection counts coming from the very highly countries of Israel and the UK, well, you'd be deplatformed, which of course he absolutely was. How about the notion of viral immune escape? This is a theory that variants may actually be caused by mass. Well, of course, I mean, you're going to have mutations. I mean, it's a theory that no one is supposed to ask questions about, discuss, educate on. After all, that might create more hesitancy, and we can't have that. We know that if we keep people completely in the dark and don't answer their questions, that encourages them more, said no one ever. Yet we've never tried to mass the whole entire world at once with mRNA that still are going through the whole validation process. And some virologists fear that it could maybe perhaps be putting selective pressure on the virus. Maybe it's mutating thereby making more resistant strains. Like there's another one called the Lambda. Well, that's what's being suggested. Evolutionary biologists like Brett Weinstein, they've been demonized simply for asking questions about viral immune escape. And I'm not saying that Brett Weinstein is right. I'm just saying that why are we so afraid to consider Weinstein's concern? That's also shared, by the way, by Dr. Robert Malone. Who's he? Oh, just the inventor of the mRNA. And by the way, he's been receiving death threats for putting this viral immune escape theory forward. So why can't their theories be discussed? I mean, after all, what if the creator of the mRNA, what if he's right or even kind of right? It's our health at stake. Can we not talk about it at all? Are we just going to discount the theory? Have the CDC show us why a given theory is wrong? I mean, remember, many of these same experts suggested lab escape was the most likely origin of the virus well before Legacy Press acknowledged this possibility. And these scientists were deplatformed for suggesting it. But now even the Biden administration admits lab escape is a very real possibility. And speaking of lab escape, if it's a bioweapon or a lab-made virus, don't we need to kind of talk openly about that? Don't we need to take steps to ensure that gain-of-function experiments are not done again? And certainly not with our tax dollars at a lab in a communist country who is our enemy. And we don't need to talk about sanctioning and suing the CCP for possibly causing a worldwide pandemic that killed millions. What about the coronavirus therapeutics? There's some therapeutics that field doctors have had tremendous successes with, like ivermectin, that are a part of early treatment protocols that work. But the CDC doesn't seem to have much of a recommendation on early treatment protocols to offer. So if you're infected with the Rona and you're told to stay home and wait and hope the infection resolves, but for some, they end up very sick after it progresses, and then it's straight to the emergency room where then they're often put on a ventilator, which isn't good. Yet all generic therapeutics are discounted and the CDC's only treatment seems to be mask up, and shut up. That's apparently the one and only policy they have. And why will that name alone, ivermectin? Why does that get you tossed off social media? I honestly can't tell you how many friends I've had that have been suspended temporarily or permanently because of that. Is it because it's an off-label generic drug that makes the approval of maybe in development impossible? If you mention that idea, you'll totally get censored. And the problem with all of this, it's our health that may suffer if we can't hear different opinions or even speak truth. Now rumors of mandated for the military are imminent, but there's no discussion about whether this is appropriate to do or even allowed. If mandated do happen, it'll likely cause some of our best servicemen and women to leave the military rather than be forced to take an experimental that they don't need, especially since hardly any soldiers, what is the fatality? Show us the numbers, because it doesn't look like they're, not even in double digits. So of course, you're gonna have another hit to the military. And again, because the left politicized the pandemic like the left politicizes everything, the government ends up having to bully and censor people who resist, which means we're no longer following the science. We're following some kind of political agenda, one that the administration doesn't seem keen on sharing with us. And so when people ask questions about that agenda, they're censored, or they're told that they don't need to know the answers, trust us, and that's what happened in this exchange between Fox's Peter Doocy and Deputy Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre. Watch.
President Biden says that we are not returning to lockdowns, shutdowns, and school closures, but he also once said that we didn't have to wear masks anymore once we were. So why should Americans trust him now?
Well, because we listen to the scientists, we listen to the expert. This is a public health situation. This is not about politics at all. This is about saving lives. And this is what the president is all about. He wants to make sure that we are saving lives. If you look at, Peter, the last 6 months, that's what he's done every day. And you see that in the numbers. Now we're at a point where we have to double down and make it very, very clear to people that we can't let the pandemic win. We have to continue to fight.
She's way nicer than Jen Psaki. But this, too, by the way, is a form of censorship because they're not transparently sharing the data behind their policies. And this is where censorship in America is taking us, to no place good. It didn't have to be this way. It hurts everybody because it creates distrust and resistance to government policy. Corrupts health agencies because they're not being held to account for their words and actions. It turns Americans against each other because we're essentially saying there's only one right way to think about these very complex and nuanced issues. Finally, all of the politicization and censorship, it's hurting our ability to navigate a crisis and come out the other side united. Censorship is un-American. So whatever the difference is about masks and therapeutics or passports, people need to be able to freely discuss it. Enough with the censorship, right? People need to listen to each other and not demonize each other. And we better get busy doing just that before it's too late. So coming up, we continue this discussion with Phil Kerpen and break down some real coronavirus data. And I am not censoring my guest. So from here on out, no more beeps. Keep it here. Joining me now, someone who has followed this data and science since day one. Phil Kerpen is the president of American Commitment, and he joins me now. Phil, good to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be with you, Dana.
So I was following you on social media earlier as there was, because I know Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida was getting a lot of heat. He came out, there was another video of him that came out today and was saying, parents, use your best judgment about masking your children. You were sharing some very interesting data as well about kids and masks and schools, these mask mandates that were saying that either students have to have them, staff has to have them. You had shared a piece that was saying that the data that we have actually shows higher cases of contraction of this virus than without the mask mandates. Talk to us a little bit about that, because at first glance you would think that kind of just flies in the face of, well, it's to prevent the virus, but it actually with kids, kids aren't really the carriers. Schools have never been hotspots.
Well, we've got the data's kind of all over the map with this, Dana, and I'm not sure we can conclude necessarily that the schools that don't mask children have lower case rates, although that is what some of the data sets show. But the really interesting thing to me is that every single source, no matter which one you look at, just shows microscopic case rates among children, and in particular shows that they're not drivers of the epidemic and never have been. And that's especially significant now when, even if they were spreading it, all of the adults have been offered vaccination if they want it. And so, the CDC, if you look on their Science Brief website, where they try to justify their recommendation for masking children in schools, they've got about 4 or 5 studies that are completely irrelevant to that question, because they just look at schools where there were masks and say there was very low case rate. But there probably would have been a very low case rate without the masks. Unless you're comparing masked to unmasked, it doesn't really tell you anything about masks. The one citation that they have that does that compares masked to unmasked, is from the first semester last year in Florida, where the case rates were very low in all of the schools, but they were slightly higher in the schools that did not mask. And you might think, oh, well, that must mean something, that must prove something, except if you look at the whole year, if you look at the second semester and you add it in, the opposite is true. In the full year data in Florida, the schools that did not mask had lower case rates than the ones that did. And so I'm not sure it makes much of a difference either way. The only study the CDC has was that first semester one. Second semester had the exact opposite result. And frankly, if you believe CDC, here's the other thing that's so remarkable. If you believe CDC, 40% of school-age kids somehow were exposed to this virus by the end of March. That's their burden estimate. So they had very low case rates. They weren't getting in school. They weren't, by and large, getting sick. They didn't even know they had it. But CDC wants us to believe that 40% of them had it by March, which means half of all school-age kids probably had it by now, which means whatever we were doing didn't prevent them from getting it. The reason they had so few hospitalizations and deaths is that being a child is protective, not because of anything we did to them.
Oh, that's a very good point, because they're just not physically mature enough to be able, as I understand it, it has to do with like receptors in your respiratory system, et cetera.
There are a lot of theories as to why, but the point that I've been making is, if you believe the CDC number that 40% of kids had already had it by March, then anything and everything we did to prevent them from getting infections was a total waste, because they got the infections, they just didn't get sick.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. What do you make of, and I was reading this actually the other day, Sweden being mask-free, they're close to 0 fatalities daily. Their chief epidemiologist was playing down some of the fears of the Delta variant. They said that they had maybe like 1 coronavirus fatality per day. Everyone kind of brings up Sweden and cites them as, well, they didn't force everyone to shut down. They didn't force everyone into masks. I mean, is there something else that could play into it? Because I would just think those results could be replicated if everyone followed that same thing, but I'm not sure that is the case in a number of states, and then comparing that with Sweden, et cetera. What are your thoughts about that data?
Well, I think that the far northern latitudes like Sweden seem to have a single season in the winter. They don't have kind of what we have in the U.S., which is sort of this double season where we have both a winter season and a summer season. So there are a lot of complex factors that go into the seasonality of viruses. It's not very well understood. It has to do with things like temperature and humidity, but also potentially solar radiation, which is why you get different patterns at different latitudes, and obviously behavior as well. People being inside when it's air conditioned and that kind of thing. So, I don't know why Sweden doesn't have any summer activity with this virus. The really interesting question is going to be what their winter looks like this year, and if they have another bad winter wave like they did last year. And I'm not sure anyone has the answer to that, but I do think that the approach that they've had, which is similar to Florida, in that they haven't panicked, they haven't locked things down, they've gone on with life and had society operate, hasn't led to any higher deaths than anywhere else. All the places are more or less in the same range, but it has led to a lot more happiness, if you believe the polling, and a lot better economic outcomes compared to the countries that were shutting things down.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And comparing also with the United Kingdom, I was looking at their 74 deaths in the UK compared to the 329 deaths in the US over the same period, and that was per day. There was a lot of discussion about UK and Delta variant. It seems like they've gone through their peak already. with the Delta variant. So it seems like that, that could be perhaps a little bit predictive for the United States in terms of our dealing with that. Do you think that that's that's an accurate assessment? Are we sort of looking to follow the UK in terms of what they had? I mean, it's very contagious, and you're going to have higher rates of contractions of people getting this, but the fatalities won't be like the original.
Yeah, I think the UK data is really encouraging. And, there's a lot of panic right now because we're having a much steeper rise in certain places, especially across some of these southern states like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Florida, than we had in previous waves. And that panic is not well justified if you consider the experience in the United Kingdom and India before that, which is where the Delta variant first arose. And that experience is you do get a much sharper rise than you have with the previous versions of the virus, but then you get a much sharper fall. And so you get sort of this narrow, very high epidemic curve as opposed to the broader curves that we've got in the previous waves. And I think that we're going to start seeing some of these earlier states peak the way the UK did this week. I think that Arkansas and Louisiana and Missouri are probably going to be first. And then the sort of a week later, we'll probably get Florida and Texas. And so I do think we're going to get peaks relatively soon. When there's total panic and they're calling for shutting things down, that's usually when you're getting close to the peak, judging by what we've seen in the previous waves. And I think based on what we saw in the UK, we're going to see very, very sharp declines once we do reach those peaks. And notably, in the UK, they ended all of their restrictions. They had what they called Freedom Day right at the top of the peak. And all of the modelers and the doomsayers, the usual folks, were saying the cases were going to go up even higher, and it was a terrible, horrible thing to do. And instead, the curve followed exactly the path that it was on, and it dropped very sharply without any of the restrictions, which I think should really give encouragement to these governors that are really getting it hard from the media and the public health guys to just say, to hold their course, to wait, hit that peak, and then to enjoy that very sharp decline that I think we've got coming in these places.
Yeah, that's a very good point. A very good point with that. Talking with Phil Kerpen. Phil, I know that there are other variants out there. There's the Lambda variant, and I know there's probably going to be even variants after this that the United States is going to have to deal with. I mean, it's a virus, and we're just going to have to acclimate to it. What do you make of and I know that there's some scientists and some researchers say that the quickness with which we moved to get everyone to implement the vaccination rollout, that whole process, is that a factor? I mean, I know that some are saying it, not a lot, but there's some out there in science and in medical profession that are saying that that can actually encourage mutations, and that contributes to some of these lesser contagious and lesser virulent variants. Is that, I mean, what do you put truth in that? I mean, what is your take on that?
I'm kind of skeptical of both sides of that. I don't think that having lots of people who are not vaccinated makes, particular mutations and variants more likely. And I don't think that having too many people vaccinated does either. And I'll tell you why I don't think either of those theories holds a lot of water. And that is, this is a zoonotic virus. This thing is jumping between almost every mammal species on the planet. The USDA just did a study. They found 33% of white-tailed deer in the United States test positive for antibodies. That means they've had this virus. We know that it was in mink in Europe. We know that it's been in bats. And so I just think, there are going to be lots of reservoirs out there. Viruses continue to change. That's kind of the story of the world forever. The good news is when you have a virus that's much, much more dangerous than the average virus, like this one, almost all mutations are going to make it less dangerous, not more, just because of reversion to the mean. And the fact that when you have an outlier that you're starting with, you're probably going to be moving in the direction of a more typical virus almost every time. And so I think that's the optimistic case. That's the reason to be optimistic about new variants. The other thing is that this is a relatively simple virus. It's not like flu, which can combine in an almost infinite number of ways. And so I think we're going to start to reach kind of the terminal point of mutation where we've kind of seen all the different mutations that can arise that are clinically significant, and you're going to start to see repeats and just independently the same things arising that we've already seen before, and we're already starting to see that with some of these mutations.
And to be clear, too, we're still talking with Phil Kerpen. We're still too early, I think, into this to be able to make a prediction as to if it's going to be seasonal or not, or how that would look.
Well, I think that it's almost certainly going to be seasonal. All of the other coronaviruses are. The interesting thing to me, though, is the other coronaviruses are all sort of winter, spring seasonal. And this one, we seem to have this double pattern where we're getting it in the summer in the lower latitudes. And kind of it's a day we're getting more of a classic seasonal pattern in the northern latitudes. And the question is, will that settle into an annual thing, or will the summer season kind of disappear as population immunity gets stronger? And I'll tell you, I do really think that from a political standpoint, this double season is the worst thing we could ever have, because whenever people get comfortable in the spring that everything's back to normal and they're getting ready for the next school year, the summer season hits and it scrambles everything politically again. And so I think that one of the big open questions is whether we're going to have kind of this double seasonal pattern where we get it in the summer and the winter, or whether it's going to settle into being another winter bug like the other coronaviruses. And I just don't think we know yet.
Oh yeah, definitely. Good boy. I love the political uncertainty that sets up. Boy, that makes it feel good. Phil Kerpen, appreciate you paying attention to actually following the data on this. I wish other people in our government agencies would. Thanks so much for your time and for explaining all of this to us.
Thanks.
Of course. All right, folks, coming up, we will be joined by Dr. Nan Hayworth. She is going to discuss some of the latest, particularly as it relates to kids, next. Keep it here. One, two, three. So with all of the data and the facts surrounding children and the coronavirus, why is there this push for kids now to get vaccinated and be forced to wear masks in a number of schools? Dr. Nan Hayworth is with the Independent Women's Forum and a former New York Congresswoman. And I'm sure she knows a lot more about this than all of the YouTube fact checkers that have been suppressing everyone's accounts who talk about it out there. She joins us now to discuss. Dr. Hayworth, thank you so much for being here. It's good to see you. I have to ask, what is the point in putting these meaningless restrictions on kids? I mean, we had a lot of this data from the very, very beginning about how they are not these super spreaders. Schools are not super spreaders. So why are we back now at square one with masks and vaccines for kids?
Dana, I think fundamentally it is political. I hate to say that, but the Biden CDC is run by panic and politics. There are no data, and you have discussed it cogently and in great detail and very intelligently on your own program. There are no data to support burdening children with masks, particularly young children for whom masking, frankly, is also a social and psychological imposition. So this is actually a cruel act toward children. And there are no data on either disease among children, the COVID-related severe disease. Yes, some children's deaths have been attributed to COVID, as they are to influenza, seasonal flu every year. We don't want anyone to die of a virus, but these things are unfortunately, they are events that happen. There's no data to support that children are major sources of infection for vulnerable adults. So this is, and certainly in terms of vaccines, frankly, there's really no evidence that they are necessary for children, and the FDA has not even approved them for adults yet. So I understand why parents would be hesitant to even consider vaccines for their children, and there's no evidence that they're needed.
Yeah, we're talking to Dr. Nan Hayworth. I was looking at this report, a study that came out of the UK that was released last week, and it said that even if kids were to transmit the virus, it would be at a much lower rate. And this was according to the lead researcher, the epidemiologist, Dr. Shamez Ladani, who led the study. They said that children aren't taking the virus home and then transferring it to the community. They have little, if any, capacity to even infect household members. And it's very, very a dramatic departure from what we're hearing from our own government here. And you would think, if we're following the science, why isn't everyone's science the same on this?
Right. No, it is political, Dana, because teachers' unions who are symbiotic with the Democrats, they own each other. Teachers' unions, the education government complex, is seeking billions of dollars of new funding. And they have a whole social justice agenda. The LA Teachers Union certainly was quite overt about it last summer. The New York City Teachers Unions have been obvious about it as well. So they are holding children hostage with burdens, with impositions, with doubts about whether or not they can make teachers sick. Basically, they can't. But they're doing this in order to justify their demands for political concessions and for resources. And it's a terrible, terrible thing to have to say. But I think that is the root cause, Dana, and all too many in the medical establishment have been co-opted by this. And I think somehow they think in some way they are advancing social justice by buying into this whole mentality. And it's just wrong.
It's incredibly wrong. The messaging on this, it was a piece I was looking at just earlier, talking about the White House's back and forth finger pointing between the Biden administration and the CDC. And a lot of people were talking about that 335 number. They said CDC had listed on their website, oh, these are 335 kids, these are the fatalities. But then Wall Street Journal and Johns Hopkins, they looked at the number, and I mean, I haven't seen it this many call outs before in the medical community, or at least publicly. And they accused the CDC of not vetting each of the cases. They said they did. They looked at thousands of cases and they found that 335 number, those children had secondary health issues, pretty serious ones. So then we fund the CDC with our tax dollars. Surely, Dr. Hayworth, we should be able to get a return on our investment in the form of transparency and data. So where's the work? They have 21,000 employees. How come we aren't getting any of this information?
And this is a problem that extends back for many years, Dana. There was evidence of dysfunction during the Trump administration, and I don't blame President Trump for it. This is a very deeply established bureaucracy, among whom I'm sure there are people who very genuinely have talents and want to do the right thing. But in government in general, a political gloss certainly has taken hold over the past couple of decades, and most folks in government are, members of or favorable to the party of government, which is the Democrat Party, and this mindset is ingrained within them. They can't get out of it, and it leads to institutional failures, because especially if you're trying to look, I have a science background myself, I'm a doctor. You have to look at every phenomenon with fresh eyes every day. You have to leave your previous biases behind. And they obviously have a lot of trouble doing that, and especially given that the leadership is assigned by the current administration. Dr. Walensky is just a disaster.
Oh my goodness, a huge disaster. I haven't seen a department be so back and forth and all over the place with this information, and then try to shame people who don't have a lot of faith in either what they're telling them, or even, who are hesitant about the vaccine. And to this point, with your medical background, Dr. Hayworth, I just wanted to ask you a final question. With kids particularly, the masking and the vaccinations, the masking, we went through this with my kids in school. Talk a little bit about what that does psychologically to kids as well, because just from what I'm hearing from my kids and their friends, they're a little hostile when they see celebrities and political leaders who are out and about maskless, and then now they're talking about having to go to school masked again, possibly, after they did everything that they were asked to do last academic year. Talk a little bit about what's this actually doing to kids?
Dana, I really feel that it is a social and psychological barrier, and there's certainly there seems to be evidence to support that in some grim statistics, as we know, emerging especially among pre-adolescent and adolescent children. There is a higher incidence of depression. There is a higher incidence, unfortunately, of suicide, and that's reaching into, at least I've seen one report, I think, a 10 or 11-year-old these things, of course, happen under the best of circumstances, but it certainly seems as though we are psychologically burdening these kids. You need to see people's faces. You need to see their mouths, their lower faces. You need to have some sense that we are able to relate to each other, not to be behind masks and behind barriers. And not only that, but for the development of their immune systems, it's actually good for them to be exposed to, frankly, to germs, because that's how their immune systems develop a robust library of things that they can recognize later in life. So there's really every argument to oppose masking, and there's no good argument for masking. And I appreciate your calling it out and being a great advocate for common sense, because we really desperately need that to spread.
Goodness.
Like
well, and I appreciate you following the science. We need that. We need more of that. Dr. Nan Hayworth, thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate you.
My privilege. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Of course. All right, folks, we have a lot more for you coming up next. Stay with us. Well, Joe Biden has a message for you and anyone who does not agree with the CDC's COVID policy. Get out of the way. Take a look.
What are we doing? COVID-19 is a national challenge, and it must come together. We have to come together, all of us together, as a country to solve it. Make no mistake, the escalation of cases is particularly concentrated in states with low vaccination rates. Just 2 states, Florida and Texas, account for 1/3 of all new COVID-19 cases in the entire country. Just 2 states. Look, we need leadership from everyone. If some governors aren't willing to do the right thing to beat this pandemic, then they should allow businesses and universities who want to do the right thing to be able to do it. I say to these governors, please help. But if you aren't going to help, at least get out of the way of the people who are trying to do the right thing. Use your power to save lives.
Seems the free Shake Shack fries in the lottery phase of the get out the vax drive is over. Now it's do what we say or get out of the way. Mask up, vax up, and shut up. Or just get out of the way. That kind of seems to be Biden's message to red states and their governors. It's ironic, too, because when Trump wanted to secure our border, all blue state governors did. And yes, that all they did was get in the way. They would obstruct federal government, or they would have DHS try to file suit. Oh my gosh, it went on forever. Democratic governors and mayors created sanctuary cities. They refused to comply with ICE on deportations of even violent criminals like rapists and murderers, no joke. And even when those people, they would catch them. There was one case of someone who assaulted a woman and then was put into jail, and then they ended up letting him go. ICE wanted to deport him. He had been deported several times. This is what Democrats did, right? Democrats basically did everything that they could to make it impossible to enforce law as it relates to border interior enforcement. And now that Democrats are running all of DC, they expect absolute compliance about the coronavirus from red state governors, particularly governors like Ron DeSantis. Well, here is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis's response to President Biden. Watch.
Biden, he rejects science because he denies the fact that people that recover from COVID have long-lasting immunity. And that's been proven time and time again, and the data is very clear. So his vision is, just like in New York City, restaurants should ban young kids from being able to go in because they're not eligible for vaccination, and law-abiding citizens have to produce proof of their medical records just to go to the gym or attend an event or just to participate in everyday society. He wants that, but yet if you want to vote, he thinks it's too much of a burden to show a picture ID when you're voting. So no voter ID, but have to show your medical papers just to be able to live in everyday life? Give me a break. And so I think the question is we can either have a free society or we can have a biomedical security state. And I can tell you, Florida, we're a free state.
Good on him. And no wonder Biden is big mad. When you're trying to consolidate your power by exploiting a pandemic, governors like Ron DeSantis, they really are going to throw a wrench into your plans. See, in order to condition Americans to get them accustomed to this idea of having their civil liberties routinely violated, you have to create inordinate amounts of fear. You need case counters on whirling on CNN and gloom and doom from the CDC talking heads and lots of just hyperbolic chatter about how whatever government draconian policy you're recommending is all to save lives. That's all right. That's all they say. The last thing that you need when you're hyping up the fear, as in the very last thing that you need, is some Yahoo governor down in Florida saying that no more masks in schools or lockdowns ever. Why? Because all this normal living might just expose the fact that many in blue states are still living a real life version of M. Night Shyamalan's, I know I said his name wrong, but The Village. Oh my gosh, have you not watched that movie with Bryce Dallas Howard and Joaquin Phoenix? You need to go watch The Village because it's legit like what they're going through right now. And that's right where the Biden administration wants them. Sidebar, without like the red cloak, like wolf things. For real. No, they want people to be hostages to their own fears and neurosis, afraid to venture out and live. But it's kind of hard to maintain that illusion of fear when you see spring break happening in Florida and packed stadiums in Texas with no masks, to say nothing, by the way, of Lollapalooza in Chicago. Just life continuing as it always has. It's not that these places don't have the virus. I mean, obviously they do. It's just that Texans and Floridians, they've just chosen not to live in constant fear of the virus. Just visit one of those freedom states, right? Tennessee, Idaho, South Dakota, Texas, Florida, to name a few, which all happen to be red states, by the way. And you notice everyone is just chill, right? Not everyone's like Karen on 11. They're like way more chill. And they're aware that, yeah, there's a virus going around, but we're not going to stop living. We're going to be proactive. We're going to acclimate, you know, and that's true. That's the only way to deal with it. So no wonder the president is going after these red state governors. They make him look ridiculous. These leaders in their states, they completely destroy the narrative that American life has to radically change and shut down in order to coexist with the coronavirus. They're living proof that there's more than one way to, this is going to sound, well, I'm going to say it, skin the COVID cat. Or bat, really, right? We've tried the fear, we've tried the masks, the lockdowns, and discovered that lots of people got sick and they died anyway. And a lot of people died from drug overdoses and not even getting access to preventative care. We only added to all of this pain because we missed out on life and we crushed our economy. So in red state America, people just decided to get on with life. And the virus is going to virus, as they say. You be proactive, you acclimate, you take care of vulnerable people. That's what they've been doing. And these red state governors that Joe Biden would like to get out of the way, they're proving that it's possible to live with the virus, and really live and get on with it. And that's a problem when the program you're dead set on instituting, seemingly forever, is mask, vax, lockdown, and repeat. Mask, vax, lockdown, and repeat. Well, here's to hoping that these red state governors don't buckle under the pressure from the federal government, because it's only going to get more intense. Because if it weren't for you Neanderthals, as Joe Biden apparently likes to refer to you, Abbott, DeSantis, and others, we might have never been able to actually venture out without getting arrested or taking a deep mask-free breath of fresh air in the sunshine, warm air, and realize that it was possible to leave the fear and lockdowns behind. That does it for us for tonight. Thanks for joining us and for this special episode of No Apologies. Good night, and remember, don't bend a knee.